So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at sensation and perception. So first of all, we need to understand what is the difference between sensation and perception. So sensation refers to the detection and the very basic sensory experience of environmental stimuli. So basically, sensation means environmental stimuli. So that can be everything from, from an auditory sound, something we hear, something we see, something we smell, something we touch. That process refers to sensation. Now, perception, on the other hand, is the process of integrating. It's an organizing and interpreting the sensations in meaningful ways. So that's when our brain actually takes in the sensory experience, processes it, and then makes sense of it. So by the time, say, take for instance, we are smelling something, once we've taken in the sensory information, the brain actually interprets it, processes it, and then we give it a name. We make sense. We make it meaningful. So take, for instance, we will say, oh, that's the smell of a rose, or that smells like chicken soup, or something like that. That is perception. So here are the basic steps of sensation and perception. So very quickly here, all it is step one, is when someone senses. So take, for instance, this woman is just sensing, she just, her receptor cells in her olfactory senses, they are actually just taking in the information from the flower. Then once that information goes into her olfactory senses, it actually goes up into the brain and starts to process. And then the third step is when finally perception is achieved. So she says to herself, oh, it smells like a lily. And so those are the three basic steps of sensation and perception. So there's a few actually important terms that you have to be familiar with. That's really important for this chapter. Number one, sensory receptors. That's the special, unique cells to each sense organ that respond to a particular form of sensory stimulation. So basically, we have our olfactory sensory receptors, that take in information that goes up into our brain, and we process that as smelling type information. That's just a very, very brief. I'm trying to keep this very simple for now because I know this is going to be a lot of material in this chapter. So I will do my best to be very simple and very clear about this. Okay. So, and then sensory adaptation. That's a decline in sensitivity to a constant stimulus. So take, for instance, when you first walk into a room, you might smell some flowers that are in the room. And you'll say, oh, wow, that's a lot of, those flowers smell really good. But then you spend more time in the room, and then after a while, you're not quite as aware of the smell of the flowers. So that is known as sensory adaptation. Your senses, they adapt to that. And then finally, transduction. That's a very important term right here, transduction. And that's when our brain, remember when I told you it processes the incoming information and makes sense of it? That process by which, the physical energy is converted into a coded neural signal that can be processed by the nervous system, that is called transduction. So that's the process of processing the incoming information and converting it into coded neural signals. So remember, neural means, means nerves, and especially, the nervous system that's in the brain. Okay, so subliminal perception. So subliminal means below the threshold of conscious perception or awareness. So that means, you're not consciously aware of it, although your sensory apparatus is still taking in the information. So, like a lot of you have probably heard of, something like subliminal programming or something. Like, say, take for instance, one goes to the movie theater, and you've heard the rumor that those at the theaters that they'll flash subliminal messages, to go buy some popcorn or something like that. So those really, if that's true, it's not shown to really influence our behavior so much. And then the effect of any kind of subliminal type perception or stimuli, it's a very brief effect. It's not long lasting. Okay, so for the rest of this chapter, we're going to actually be looking into the various types of sensation and perception. And I highly recommend that you view this video in segments according to possibly each type of sensory type process. And take, for instance, we're going to start talking about vision, how we see, what we see, and everything. So I highly recommend that you focus on just one segment at a time instead of trying to watch the entire video and then memorize everything, because there's actually a lot of information in this chapter. So coming back to what we were doing here, we're going to start taking a look at vision. So what we see. So what we do is, when we are actually able to perceive, visual type stimuli, that is actually light. That's, that's electromagnetic energy, and light actually reaches our eyes in waves. And you can see here at this, invisible long waves right here. These are very long waves. But then there's a little bit right here, this little section right here called visible light. That's what we humans perceive. So we perceive just a very small segment of the entire spectrum. And then as the waves get faster, they get into ultraviolet rays, X-rays, cosmic rays, etc. We cannot perceive those consciously again. And then, right here, as we look at our spectrum that we're able to perceive, this is it right here. So it goes from this to this. Now, I'm not worried about the rate of speed, but just know though that the rate of speed actually, as those change, we actually perceive different colors. As you can see, this, red right here. This is, 750 to 700, but then when we get into yellow, it's around 600, et cetera, et cetera. So just know, though, that the different rates of speed of the waves, those actually cause us to perceive different colors. That's how we perceive different colors. So this is how we see. This is the human visual system. And so basically, I highly recommend, I'm not going to read through each one of these, but I definitely recommend that you pause the video here, take notes, and become aware of some of these important concepts and terms. So I will briefly go through this in order, to save time for us here on this video. So first of all, the light reaches our cornea and lens, and then it projects the image of what we are perceiving onto the retina. And then that optic nerve that exits the retina at the optic disc, so please, keep in mind here, I don't expect you to memorize all these terms here. But this is just how it works. So please continue on your own. Start to go along, right here and just follow this process and just become familiar with it. At this, phase, studying this chapter, It's not important that you totally memorize every single one of these steps or this sequence. Okay, so parts of the eye, how we see, so in our human visual system, our eyes, first of all, we have what's called the cornea. That's the clear membrane that covers the front of the eye. It does most of the focusing of the image. Then it reaches our pupil and iris. Remember, our pupil and iris, that kind of refers to the colored part of the eye. That's the iris, and the hole formed by the iris. That's right in the, the dark part right in the circle in the middle of our eye. That's the pupil. And remember, those can dilate or expand, according to, how much light is coming in, so we can process it, just like a camera. Okay, and that controls the amount of light entering the eye. And then we have what's called the lens, and that focuses the image on the retina. Okay, so just know that. The lens, that's what focuses the image. Now, in our retina, that actually happens in the back of our eye. That is the part that is in the very back edge wall of our eye. We have what's called rods and cones, and those are sensory receptors that respond to the incoming light. So this is actually an enlarged image right here of rods and cones in the human eye. Now, those are called photoreceptors. Photo means light in this regard. So these are receiving light. That's what they mean by photoreceptor, receiving light. And so when the rods and cones, when light reaches them, they actually undergo chemical reactions that send those signals to the brain. So, what do the rods and cones do? First of all, the cones, those are have the strongest imagery for us to process, and those are actually process our color vision. And those are what are active whenever we're in daylight, or light rooms, lots of light and everything. It's our cones that are functioning. But once we get into a dark room or the sun goes down and it starts getting darker, then our rods will actually start to kick in. They'll actually start to function. And so that's why if suddenly, like take for instance, you're sitting in a room, with the light on, and then the light turns off suddenly, it can take like upwards of 30 minutes for us to adjust and to be able to see in the dark. That's because our rods need to actually start activating. So that's what this refers to right here. So also in our basic, field of vision and everything, we have what's called a blind spot. And that's basically where it contains no photoreceptors in that part where, so they say, the optic disc where the ganglion nerve cells leave the retina. I don't expect you to memorize that, but just know that the blind spot, it's blind because it has no photoreceptors in it. So light cannot be processed there. But what's kind of interesting though, even though we have a blind spot, actually our brain, it fills in that spot with the surrounding environment patterns. So we won't experience a blind spot in our field of vision. Now, here's just some interesting imagery right here about the neural pathways from the eye to the brain. Now, the thing is, this is what I think you will find interesting is right here, the incoming light touches the eye, and then remember the retina is at the back of the eye. Then once it's encoded into neural signals, that is transferred through our optic nerve. This is this long nerve right here. And this actually travels all the way to the back of our brain to what this is called the visual cortex. And so that is where actually our vision is processed right there. So, it travels all throughout the brain here. Okay, and then what's interesting right here is we have a part right here. So here's our, our left eye and our right eye. This is looking at from underneath the brain, by the way. This is not from a top. This is from the bottom up, looking from the underneath. So the left eye, did you notice that right here it crosses and it goes into the right side of the brain? Well, that point at which it crosses right here, that's actually called the optic chiasm. That is how you pronounce this right here, the optic chiasm. So that is where our field of, our neural pathways cross right there from our eyes. So the left going into the right and the right crossing over into the left part of the brain, into the visual cortex. So that's how our actual neural pathways work when we are visualizing. Now, how do we see color? So basically, we see color through processing 3 different basic colors, and they are red, blue, and green. And then by combining those 3 colors, they actually form the other colors. As you can see right in here, this is where the others, combine and meet. And rods, they are colorblind, but cones allow us to see the different colors. So just kind of, be aware of that. Okay. Don't worry about all the nanometers and that kind of thing, about perceiving colors, unless you were extremely interested in this and you want to go into this field for your work or for your field of interest or whatever. Okay. Now here's some important 3 terms to be aware of: hue, saturation, and brightness. Okay. So hue, that just refers to the certain type of color. So this right here, the hue is blue, roughly. Okay. Now saturation, that means how deep is the blue. So this is a real deep blue, but did you notice right in here, this is a lighter blue? Well, that refers to differences in saturation. Okay. And third, we have the term called brightness. Now, brightness just means the amount of light that is reaching the eye, which causes us to see colors with a certain level. What we just typically just say, hey, that's a very bright blue, or that's a very bright red, or that's a dull green or something. Well, that's what they refer to as brightness. Okay, let's move on. So we have 2 different theories of color vision. And the 2 theories are called Trichromatic Theory. And I referred to that. Tri means 3. Okay. So trichromatic, chroma means color. Okay. So 3-color theory. And remember, when we are able to perceive color, we perceive either blue, red, or green. That's the trichromatic theory. But the opponent process theory, on the other hand, I'm going to actually go to that right here. So I've explained the trichromatic theory to you. Feel free to pause this if you want to look at this a little more in depth. But the opponent process theory, basically, that just talks about the opposing pairs of color receptors. So that just says that generates 3 systems, like a red and green, blue and yellow, and black and white. And so when one member of a color pair is stimulated, the other member is inhibited. So just be aware of those. I don't expect you to memorize this, because, unless you plan on being an ophthalmologist or something, or a neuroscientist. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on now, and we're going to take a look at hearing. And now there's a scientific term for hearing too, and that is the term called audition. And that would be A-U-D-I-T and then I-O-N. That's the process of hearing, audition. Okay, now remember when energy meets either our eyes or our ears or something, remember those are actual waves that are actually that we're perceiving. So this just shows you some different waves right here. So what's important to know is that high-pitched sounds, like take for instance, I'm just going to use musical instruments, like a high-pitched like flute or something, that will use faster waves. And so what's important to know about waves, there's a couple terms here, okay? First of all, frequency. So you notice that the faster the waves are, the more frequent we perceive them, hence the word frequency. And then how tall the waves are, that is called amplitude. Okay, amplitude refers to how loud the sound is, hence the word amp, like thinking about like a loud guitar amplifier or something like that. So amplitude, that refers to volume. Now, did you notice right here, a low pitch sound, like take for instance a tuba, that actually has much slower waves, less frequency for a certain amount of time. So that is a much lower sound. But also a musical instrument, or any sound can have a complex, some high and low frequency, so that will actually help us to actually perceive a different sound. So just be aware of those, please. So a couple, things to keep in mind here. Remember, loudness, that means amplitude. That's, and then amplitude, remember, that's a loudness, that's the intensity of the wave. Okay, so these two are the same. And how we measure loudness, we use the term called decibel. Okay, so that's just, all three of those go together. Now, the frequency, remember, that's how we hear, whether a sound is kind of high pitched, low pitched, et cetera, et cetera. Now, pitch, did you notice I said high pitched or low pitched? Pitch means, is what we use, is the actual term we use when we talk about whether a sound is high or low. So, also for those of you who have some experience in music, pitch, we will refer to, instead of saying note, we'll say, okay, well, that pitch that I'm hearing is a C or a C sharp or something. Well, that refers to the frequency that is reaching our ears, and that is the actual sound that we're hearing. Okay. Now, last but not least, this is a unique word right here, timbre. Okay, so it's not timbre, it's timbre. And that actually refers to the distinctive quality of a sound. And so all timbre means is this. If we hear the exact same pitch played by two different instruments, like say we hear a tuba play a C pitch, and then we hear a violin play the pitch C, we will know the difference between the sound of a tuba or the sound of a violin because we are actually processing what's called the timbre, the unique timbre from each instrument. So I hope that helps. Let's move on. So how we hear. Okay, so that occurs in a few different steps here. So the outer ear right here, that collects the sound waves. See the sound waves entering the ear? That actually collects the sound waves. Okay, that goes into our ear canal or in our eardrum, basically. Okay, then it reaches the middle ear. Now the middle ear, that actually amplifies the sounds so we can make sense of them. We can actually perceive them, start transferring them. Now what's unique about the middle ear is there are three small bones in the middle ear, and they are called the hammer, anvil, and the stirrup. And those are all right there in the middle ear. And so those actually process the incoming sound in volume. Finally, the inner ear is where the sound is transduced into neural impulses. So remember earlier in this chapter, I used the word transduction. That is transduced. Okay, so that's sending the neural impulses to the brain. And that's how we finally are able to process and make sense of what we hear. Moving forward. So we already talked about the structures, so far. Now we're going to look at, just some of the structures of the inner ear. And this is how the sound actually gets to our brains. So first of all, we have what's called the cochlea. That's a very coiled, it's fluid-filled inner ear structure that contains basically what's called our basilar membrane and our hair cells. So those hair cells, those are like receptors for sound, And they get brittle and damaged as we age, and especially by loud noise. So those of you who have been in a lot of environments with a lot of loud noise for a long time, and you start experiencing hearing loss, that's because your hair cells in your ears actually become damaged. They're not able to sense incoming sound information. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, so how do we distinguish pitch? Remember, pitch means how high or how low a sound is, and so there's two different theories here. There's what's called frequency theory, and so basically that tells us that, frequency theory, our basilar membrane, it vibrates at the same frequency as the sound waves, because remember, each sound wave has a different rate of frequency. So the basilar membrane actually vibrates. It actually moves along at the exact same speed as the sound wave. So then what's called place theory, this is, more for low sounds, by the way, right here, frequency theory. But place theory, that's more for processing high pitch sounds. Okay. And what's unique about that is we have different, according to how high the pitch is, actually different parts of the basilar membrane will vibrate. So that's why they call that place theory. Different parts or different places in the basilar membrane, they actually vibrate and help us to discriminate how high a certain pitch is. Okay, so we're on to a new segment here, and we're going to start talking about our body senses, our chemical and body senses. Okay, so there's two basic chemical senses. We have what's called olfaction, which is really just a scientific term for smelling. That is the term right there, olfaction. That means smelling. And then our second chemical sense is what's called gustation. And gustation, all that refers to is our sense of taste. That's it. So this is smelling and this is tasting. Now we have what's called body senses. And there's four of these here. There's touch and temperature. There's pain. Then we have what's called kinesthetic. That is the location of our body. So basically, when you want to put your body in a certain position, like say for dance or martial arts or sports or something to that effect, we're using kinesthetic senses to put our body in that position. And then last but not least, we have what's called vestibular. Now vestibular, that refers to our sense of balance. That's how we sense where we're balanced or not. Okay, let's take a look at some of this. So, this is just a review on how we smell. Okay, how we actually sense, through smelling apparatus here. So please feel free to pause and look at this on your own. Okay. And we're just going to take a look at this. So this is very quick. This is pretty simple. So basically, we smell by first sensing airborne molecules in the air, odor molecules. So from this strawberry, it's actually emitting, it's allowing odor molecules to go into the air. Then we breathe those in, and those go up into our sinuses, and these reach what's called our olfactory nerve. Now, if you look at this a little closer, I'm going to follow this here, and this is actually a close-up view. This goes directly up into our part of the brain where we're able to actually sense very quickly. We're actually able to smell very quickly. Now, so that's called the olfactory nerve right here. Okay, right up in here. Okay, let's move forward. So we're going to take a look at the sense of taste. And remember, the scientific term for sense of taste is what's called gustation. So remember, we just basically have a lot of covered little bumps and grooves in our tongue. Remember, we call those taste buds. So each taste bud contains about 50 receptors. And we've basically are able to perceive 5 different basic tastes, which are sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and then what's also called umami. That's actually a Japanese word, but like take for instance, monosodium glutamate, MSG, so chemical types, flavors, that kind of thing. Okay, let's look ahead here. So this just kind of gives us an idea here, so basically this is actually a real actual taste bud right here on the human tongue. And then we can see all of the sensory receptors. Remember, there's about 50 sensory receptors in each taste bud. And just as a reminder, that taste is just one aspect of flavor, but that also includes other sensations like aroma, texture, temperature, appearance of food, etc. All those work together to help us perceive and engage in the act of gustation. Okay, so we're going to take a look at skin and body senses. Okay, so skin is our largest and heaviest sense organ, and it contains many types of sensory receptors. And some specialized receptors respond to one stimulus, and others respond to more than one. So basically, just keep in mind, sensory receptors, they're distributed unevenly among different body areas. So different parts of our body actually have more sensory receptors than others. That's just basically what you need to know here. Okay, so we know what pain is, but let's just define it really quickly. That's an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience. And that's actually associated with actual or potential tissue damage. So that's what pain is from the scientific perspective. Now we have what's called nociceptors. That's an important term here. That's our free nerve endings, and that's small sensory fibers in our skin, muscles, and internal organs. So when we first sense something through our skin, it's our nociceptors that are triggering and sending that information for our brain to actually perceive. Now we have 2 different types of pain systems here. We have what's called A delta fibers, and those are our fast pain receptors. So when we get injured, when we first feel pain, like immediately, like take for instance, if you touch something hot, and then you immediately pull your hand back and everything, that is your A delta fibers. That is your fast pain, like immediately. But then later on, you may notice, like after you got yourself burned, it's still kind of a, kind of a hurty feeling. You know what I mean? You might have a throbby, hurty feeling. And so that is actually your C fibers that are, don't worry about substance P, just C fibers. And that is our slow pain receptors. That is when we feel pain like later on. We tend to still ache after we were injured. So this is just a diagram here for you to look at. I thought I would leave this here just for you to take a look at here, okay, and study this on your own if you feel so inclined. So this is just review here. Remember your A delta fibers. Remember, those are your fast ones. That's your sharp, intense, immediate injury, immediate pain you feel to injury. C fibers, remember, that's your slow, that's longer lasting, throbbing, burning pain of injury. That's all you have to know from this here. We don't have to worry about, the neural pathways or anything like that. Okay, then we have what's called the gate control theory of pain. That's how pain travels actually through our spinal cord. Okay, so when we experience pain, and that's interpreted through our brain, then that actually sends signals down the spinal cord. And if we're able to experience the pain, that's because the gateways in our spine are actually open and we are able to experience the pain. But if the pain gateways are closed, we feel less pain. Now, some of you, you might want to even, talk about this in discussions or something, but some of you have experienced that maybe where you've gone beyond the pain. You've been training real hard in something, and you tend to feel less pain, even though you should be feeling pain, but you start feeling less pain. And that's because the pain gateways start becoming closed. Okay, so a couple terms here I just want to make you aware of. First of all, we have what's called our kinesthetic sense. Remember, that's kinesthetic refers to our sense of location and position of our body. So definitely, when one is doing sports, martial arts, dance, fitness training, whatever, we are relying on our kinesthetic senses to put our body, our brain is actually giving us feedback on the position of our body and where it's located in space. Now, our vestibular sense, remember, that's our sense of balance. So, that refers to changes in gravity, motion, body position. So let's just keep it simple and leave it at that. Vestibular means balance. Kinesthetic means location and position of our body. Then we have what's called our proprioceptors. That's just sensory receptors located in our muscles and joints, and that provide information about body position and movement. So when we are experiencing kinesthetic sensory type processing, it's our proprioceptors that are telling our brain exactly what position our bodies are in and where they're located. Okay, now there's two important terms here, and this is very important. I want you to understand here. We have what's called bottom-up processing, and that means processing information from our bodies up to our brain. So that's why they call it bottom-up processing. And so, that means moving from part to whole, called data-driven processing. So basically, our bodies are receiving data, and those are sent up to our brain. That's what bottom-up processing means. But top-down processing, that actually begins in our brains. Hence, the observer's cognitive processes. That begins in the brain and then moves down toward our body. So that's why that's called top down. It begins in the brain at the top and down into our body. And so those are two very important terms that I would like for you to definitely be familiar with. Okay, now we're going to change gears here. We're going to talk about something here that students tend to kind of get a kick out of here. ESP. ESP stands for extrasensory perception. So extrasensory, that kind of refers to detection of information by some means that are other than through our normal process of sensation. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to ask you, do you think it's possible for us to perceive information through other processes that are other than normal processes of sensation? All right, hence the term extrasensory. Do you think that's possible? Do you believe in that? It might be something you want to discuss in, our discussion forum. Now, parapsychology here, that's just, the scientific investigation of things like that. I'm not too concerned that you memorize that term, really. Okay, so we're getting close to wrapping up this chapter, but we are going to shift gears here for a little bit. We're going to talk about, well, how do we perceive shape? What is it? What is the perception of our perceptive processes of shape? Okay, and so this term right here, Gestalt psychology, this was actually refers to the study of how human beings perceive shape. Okay, that's all we need to know from this here. We're going to talk about. So take, for instance, here's a good example. So when one looks at this right here, some of you may be familiar with this, we can see two different types of shapes. It depends on how we focus. If we look at the part in white, we see maybe something that looks kind of like, a vase or, something to that effect. But then if we focus on the blue, then we see two female faces facing each other. And so how do we do that? How do we perceive that? Well, that's actually called figure-ground relationship. And Gestalt psychologists, they came up with that term because, all that refers to is we focus either on the figure, like take, for instance, if I said, focus on this white part, we're focusing on the white part, and then this becomes the background, the blue becomes the background, and vice versa. So that is the figure-ground relationship. I hope that's simple and that makes sense. Now, Gestalt psychologists, they studied, remember I told you they were very interested in how we organize, take visual elements and then organize into patterns, shapes, and forms. And so they had a few different laws and everything. I'm not going to, have you worry about memorizing all this. The law of similarity, closure, good continuation, and proximity. So here's some examples of them. Like take, for instance, when you perceive this here, these are all shaped alike. We can say, oh, okay, those are all shaped alike. Those are all basically circular in formation, or close to it, and we perceive those all as one shape, or a pattern. And then, that refers to, I'm going to go back up to here, but that's the law of similarity. Now, let me move forward here. But when we look at this, though, we know through, by continuation, right in here, we actually, we actually see that, we're able to, just go ahead and assume that these people are on a fence here. And this fence is solid. This doesn't just end right where their legs are at. So that is actually called the law of closure. Okay. So we're actually closing in with our perception where the missing parts are at on the fence. Okay, but the law of good excuse me. The law of good continuation, that just refers to that we just assume by looking at this that this train track just continues on in this direction. Even though we can't perceive it consciously, but we're able to assume that. Now, take last right here, law of proximity, okay? That just refers to we're able to perceive, this pattern of 1 and then 2 because these are in close proximity, these two right here. So we actually see those as one unit. So that's just an example of Gestalt psychology. And last but not least here, we're going to talk about depth perception. So how with our eyes, how do we perceive depth? Because we actually only receive a two-dimensional image in our retinas. So how does that get transformed into perception of 3D or 3 dimensions? And so we're going to take a look at some of this here. So there's two types of visual cues. There's what's called monocular, and that is basically just means one eye at a time. Mono meaning one, ocular meaning eye. Okay. And so that is monocular. That refers to, the depth cues that appear in either the right or the left eye, one eye at a time. Binocular means depth cues that involve comparing the left and right eye images. So in each eye, one at a time, remember that's monocular, then those are combined, those images that are in our eyes, into our binocular depth, cues. And those are combined until we eventually are able to perceive depth. Okay, so we've covered this. I'm not going to read on through this here. Okay, and then just taking a little further here, about the Gestalt psychology, So here's a couple things, So they use these terms constancy right here. And all that is that's just sort of, just thinking that, look, making observations, and just sort of, kind of assuming, that things are going to continue on the way they are. That's what they mean by constancy. So basically, like, take, for instance, this. So we look at this and we go, okay, well, I know that this is like a square, this part right here. And then these are a bunch of squares stuck together and those make a cube. So those are constancy. You've kind of stored that information in your brain over a long period of time, and you've developed a type of perceptual constancy that allows you to see that. So that's all we need to know on this. Oops, going forward. Okay, this is going to be our last slide. And so pain control. So how, this is something that you may find interesting. So how do people control pain? Especially just, using their brains. Here are some different strategies. For one, distraction, so don't focus on the pain, focus on something else. Maybe employing certain types of imagery, like take, for instance, one has an injury, but instead might be while taking their focus away, distracting themselves, might be focusing on happy imagery of them not being injured anymore and them doing something really well, using that limb or their, whatever. Okay. Relaxation and meditation, that's also been shown to be a useful strategy in pain control. Counter irritation, we won't really worry about. That just means basically, a different type of irritation. So if you're experiencing pain in one limb, you might like take, for instance, if you injured your knee or something. Well, maybe a brief pain to your fingertip or something like that might take, the pain away from your knee, and that's called counter irritation. And then last but not least, positive self-talk and reappraisal. That just means, just saying, look, this isn't going to last forever. I've got this. I can get through this and I'm going to get better. Those are some examples. So, these are, might be some good topics to discuss as well in our discussion forums. And you might, discuss either one of these or maybe another strategy that you employ or something. Okay, so that concludes our discussion about Chapter 3 material. Now, I realize that there's a lot of information in this chapter, and I highly recommend, once again, that you watch this video, only view each segment, where it focuses on one type of sensory processing, and then take notes, stop, and then maybe, see if are there any questions, relatable questions in your study guide about that. Then move on until you're finally complete, and then last but not least, if you're not clear on anything, then maybe put a question in the discussion forum or something, or share your experience to help others. So good luck, and I will see you in the next video.